Would you rather have a school uniform and be dressed like everyone else, or wear your own clothes? Requiring school uniforms takes away freedom of expression, can be a financial burden to students, and does not improve academic achievement and should not be enforced. School uniform policies are controversial for both public and private schools. Many schools have adopted strict guidelines on school dress code in recent years. Students, parents, and school administrators often disagree on proper clothing for school. Therefore, many schools have a standard uniform policy. However, students should be able to wear what they want during school hours. Students' freedom of expression is prohibited by school uniform policies. First of all, uniform policies do not allow individuality. Quote, "If young people are to understand that a cornerstone to our freedom is the primacy of the individual over government, over the collective, over any non-voluntary association, then sticking them all into look-alike clothes is a poor way to teach it." In our view, a splendid way to teach the values of freedom and responsibility is to let youngsters experience freedom and, in the process, learn to act responsibly, says Kent J. Fetzer. It also takes away students' constitutional right of freedom of expression. Quote, "Whereas, to infringe upon the rights and independence of the individual by coercing uniformity is an affront to both the spirit and the letter of law of this great nation." Kyle Sumter, a 16-year-old student at Lindblom Math and Science Academy in Chicago, stated, "They decide to teach us about people like Rosa Parks, Susan B. Anthony, and Booker T. Washington. We learned about how these people expressed themselves and conquered, and we can't even express ourselves in the hallway." This is a good example of how many students feel about school uniforms. School uniforms can also be a financial burden since they can be expensive. Private schools in particular require children to wear expensive uniforms that can only be purchased through the school or a specialty shop. Requiring that uniforms come from specific suppliers means that parents cannot use secondhand or discount stores. Most uniform policies are an attempt to make everyone equal, since some students may not be able to afford name brand clothing. However, uniform guidelines can still allow name brands to be an issue. For instance, if a uniform policy requires polo-styled collared shirts, some students may have designer shirts by designers such as Ralph Lauren. These shirts usually have a brand logo embroidered on them. Therefore, students may still be judged based on the name brand of the uniform, which defeats the purpose of making everyone equal. Academic achievement does not necessarily increase with the school uniform policy. Dr. David L. Brunsma, an assistant sociology professor at the University of Missouri, has researched this topic for 8 years. He found no statistically significant differences in school climate supporting a school uniform policy. In addition, the data do not support an improvement in academic achievement. In fact, there is a slightly negative impact at the 10th grade level in reading. There is also no significant change in school attendance that could be credited to school uniforms. Brunsma concludes that a school uniform policy should not be touted as increasing the educational atmosphere at any level of schooling. Many argue that school uniforms do not limit individuality or violate students' freedom of expression. Some argue that a school uniform isn't any different than an athletic uniform used in school sports. Many cite that court case rulings prove that school uniforms do not violate students' rights. In January 2001, school uniform policies won a huge victory when the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the plaintiff's argument that uniforms do not improve the academic environment, dampen student expression, and infringe on religious rights. Overall, most courts agree that student dress policies may be established as long as the intent for the policy is related to a legitimate government interest, says Stevens Daniels. Many school administrators argue that school uniforms reduce clothing expenses. A 2013 study by Lands in School Uniform and the National Association of Elementary School Principals found that 77% of principals and other school leaders estimated the cost of their children's uniforms to be no more than $150 a year. The same student found that 86% of school leaders believe that uniform policies ultimately reduce clothing expenses. The National Retail Federation in 2016 reported that the average family with children in elementary through secondary school planned to spend about $235 that year just on school clothes, not including the price of shoes. For many families, school uniforms policies reduce overall clothing costs. Many school administrators also believe that academic achievement is increased in conjunction with school uniform policies. According to Stevens-Daniels, one survey conducted by the NAESB principals of school that have uniform policies in place believe that students stay more disciplined and focused in their studies and feel less peer pressure. Despite opinions and research about the positive effects of school uniform policies, there are many concerns that should be reviewed. Schools should take into consideration that uniforms do not make enough difference to outweigh issues such as the students' right to individuality, financial concerns, and school academic improvements. Uniforms are not necessarily a solution to many of the problems facing education. In conclusion, school uniforms can have a negative impact on students and their education. When schools enforce uniform policies, students are not able to fully express themselves as individuals. Uniform policies indeed create a financial burden on their families. These policies do not necessarily impact student success. Schools should not enforce school uniform policies and expect their students to abide by them. One writer suggested that school uniforms are equivalent to painting a deteriorating building. It makes it look better, but does not improve the quality of the building, says Herbert L. Steffi. Requiring school uniforms can actually negatively impact student academic achievement. And I would have to say I disagree with requiring school uniforms because there isn't enough evidence and factors to support it.